Normally, I would teach a course on assisted reproduction. It would take 6 weeks. So hold on to your hats. Okay. So infertility is what gives rise to assisted reproduction or medically assisted reproduction. Infertility is defined as the inability to get pregnant after a year of regular sexual intercourse without using contraceptives. Interestingly enough, it affects about 12% of American couples, but 17% of couples in Hong Kong. I don't really know why that difference, but we do know that infertility is related to certain socioeconomic features such as poverty, sexually transmitted diseases, and age. And sometimes if you listen to the media, you think it's always women who are now trying to get pregnant in their early 40s, but that's actually not the case. And infertility is primarily affects women who are poor and do not have good access to health care. So the way to address infertility from a public health perspective is through prevention of infertility, including sexually transmitted diseases, and education about this. The conventional medical therapies used to address infertility begin with very low-tech ones. And it may just be telling the husband that he needs to change his underwear, right? If he's wearing it too tight, testicles stay too warm. But the next step would be often to give the woman drugs to enable her to ovulate if she's not ovulating, or there might be fairly minor surgery if her tubes are blocked, for example. And another conventional therapy that's been around for about 100 years or so is artificial insemination. And it can be artificial insemination by husband. Perhaps that's not the politically correct term anymore. I still use it, AIH, or by donor, and oftentimes anonymous, that's AID. And it's only if these things don't work that we would move on to the more high-tech approaches, which come under the heading of assisted reproductive technology, or ART. The main reproductive technology is in vitro fertilization, or IVF. And first, the woman is injected with superovulatory drugs over a period of about 2 weeks. This is, at the very least, uncomfortable and does bear some risks. And then, when the eggs are ready, when they are matured, egg retrieval is performed transvaginally using a needle biopsy to get them out under general anesthesia using ultrasound guidance. And then the man donates sperm in the ordinary way with a magazine, and you take that sperm and you take a high concentration of sperm and you place it in a petri dish with a lot of it around each egg in the correct growth medium. All of this has been developed over decades now of practice, and they've gotten better and better at it. Hopefully, fertilization will occur. It takes about 2 to 6 hours. And by the way, that's why there is no moment of conception. It's a process. It takes hours. And then, if fertilization occurs, the embryo, the single-cell zygote, starts to divide and becomes an embryo. And when it gets to the stage of about 100 cells, it's called a blastocyst, and that takes about 5 days. And that's now usually when they're transferring it back into the uterus, because they found that they're more healthy, they're more likely to implant, you can weed out the ones that won't if you wait till it's 5 days rather than 3 days old. Which uterus? Well, that depends on the particular situation. You could have an egg donor, and if she is also the one who will gestate the embryo, then she's going to be both the genetic mother, because it's her egg, her DNA, and also the gestational mother, because she's the one who will gestate and give birth to the fetus. Or you could have an egg donor and a different woman to be a surrogate mother, in which case the egg donor would be the genetic mother and the surrogate would be the gestational mother. And then there's a third woman who's involved, the woman who is arranging this whole thing and who plans on being the rearing mother. She might be the genetic mother, but not the gestational mother. She might be both she could be both the genetic and the gestational mother, or she might be neither at all. In other words, she could hire them to take care of this. So the background is that the first IVF baby was Louise Brown in the United Kingdom in 1978. And there had been no clinical trials for IVF, right? It was the two doctors, Steptoe and Edwards, had done this with animals, and they thought they had a pretty good chance of it working, and they said to the Browns, how would you like to try this? And the Browns had no idea that they were the first humans on whom it was being tried. Fortunately, it did work, and Louise Brown was perfectly normal and healthy and has had her own children without any need for assisted reproduction. In the early days of IVF, the success rates were pretty low. There was about a 10% chance that it would work. And this led to a lot of concerns that people had that couples who were, quote unquote, desperate to have children were spending a lot of money on a technology that really wasn't very successful. And one of the problems also is that, as with many things in medicine, it depends on who's doing it. So you got very different rates between clinics. There was nowhere to get reliable data about a particular clinic, and there was a lot of playing fast and loose with the figures. For example, they would say that their pregnancy rate was such and such. But people don't just want to get pregnant. They want to have what the well-known American bioethicist Art Kaplan calls a take-home baby. They want a healthy, alive baby to take home with them, and therefore that's the figure you're really interested in. Well, today the Centers for Disease Control collect and publish data from virtually all ART clinics, and the take-home baby rates approach pregnancy rates of fertile women in at least the most reputable and best clinics. So 40 to 50% of cycles in women under 35 result in a live birth. That's in fact a little bit better than the normal way of having a baby. At the other extreme, only 1% in women older than 44 using their own eggs have a successful outcome, which is why many infertility doctors just say it's pointless for you to try to do this. If you want to go through gestation, you really need donor eggs, because it turns out that almost everything hinges on the age of the eggs, not the age of the uterus. So here's a whole list of ethical issues that I'm going to just mention, and then I'll go through them one by one. First of all, what is the nature of what I'm going to call procreative liberty? And I'll explain that. And what is its scope? What should it be applied to? Secondly, is art the best way to help infertile people, given that it's quite expensive, and some would argue there isn't an alternative, namely adoption? Health and safety has been a concern since the very beginning. We have to look at the effects on both the mother, the pregnant woman, and the baby, the offspring, and hopefully long term. Effects on the family, because as critics have pointed out, there's a lot of people who can be involved in art, and this might prove to be confusing and raise legal problems, and also raises questions of identity among offspring. Then there's issues of commodification and exploitation. People are worried about paying large sums of money to egg donors, and that might dangle an option in front of them that they really haven't thought about very well, and surrogate motherhood even more so, because obviously gestating and giving birth to and giving up a baby is a bigger deal than giving eggs, although giving eggs is not nothing. And then finally, art and eugenics. So what is procreative liberty? This term really came into common usage in the literature with Robertson's Children of Choice, and he defines it as the right to make one's own decisions about procreation. Oh, it's supposed to be without state interference. Okay, write it in there, without state interference, with no state interference. Okay. And you can either look at it as the right to have children, right? A right to reproduce, or more precisely, a right to try to have children. Or you can look at it the flip side, it also comes under procreative liberty, the right to avoid having children through contraception and abortion. Now, what Robertson makes a very interesting sort of argument from U.S. constitutional law. He says, look, there is at least a few cases where it's been shown that it would be illegitimate for the state to try to prevent people from exercising their choice to have children by forcible sterilization, forcible contraception, or abortion. One of them actually was about a guy who had stolen a chicken, and it was his third small theft, and they were going to sterilize him, and he protested that that violated his constitutional right to reproduce, and the court said that that was correct. So then Robertson says, well, if there's a right, a fundamental moral and legal right to avoid reproduction, then why shouldn't there also be a right to reproduce? After all, we think that people who are fertile, lucky enough to be fertile, have a right to reproduce. The state can't impose on them restrictions on their reproduction, right? This is U.S., by the way, not China. And why should it make a difference if you need medical assistance to reproduce? Why should the unlucky, infertile, have less of a right to reproduce than the lucky fertile? Because after all, the reasons for wanting to have children are exactly the same whether you're fertile or infertile. You want to have your own genetically related child to raise. So Robertson argues that, in fact, infertile people do have a right to access art. He calls it a negative right. It's just a right not to have the state make it illegal. It's not a positive right, that it isn't a right to have it paid for. That's a whole other discussion as to whether it should come under insurance or other kinds of medical provisions. So procreative liberty defined as the right to either have children or not have children, and the argument, what Robertson is claiming, is that whether you are going to reproduce through coitus, coital reproduction, or whether you're going to reproduce through artificially medically assisted reproduction should make no difference to the moral right to reproduce. Now, what is the scope of procreative liberty? How far should it extend? And now I'm just looking at the right to reproduce. I'm going to narrow to that side of procreative liberty. And here what Robertson does is give us, I think, a very useful kind of model. He says, look, what are the core values in procreative liberty? And the essential core value, right at the heart, is the ability to have your own genetic child to raise, right? The further you get out from that to other kinds of uses, the less likely we think it should be protected. But if we're sticking right there, then it seems to be the same. So the most clear-cut case of the scope of procreative liberty would be a married couple, a man and a woman, and they're medically infertile, either he is or she is or together they are, and they want to have children, okay? But is it limited to that core case? What about postmenopausal women? Well, in a sense, they're infertile. They can't have babies, right? But it's not like they're infertile in the way that a woman in her 20s or 30s is infertile. That's just what happens as we age. But there have been postmenopausal women who have wanted to have children, and the question is, should they be able? Actually, in the older days of art, the question was, what about unmarried women? What about lesbians? And each of these boundaries has been addressed, and the argument has been, yeah, why shouldn't they if what they want to do is have children to raise? Then there are gay men. They can't gestate their own babies in the way that lesbian women can, but they can use surrogates. Is that okay? Okay. I think that procreative liberty has to be limited by what I call procreative responsibility. And what that means is that it would not be correct to use a technology or an arrangement that poses undue risks on offspring. But of course, then that raises a very big question: what are undue risks, and who gets to decide this? Is it the couple? Is it the doctor? Is it the medical profession? How should we think about this? And then I'm just going to mention very, very briefly something that I spent about 20 years worrying about, but so it's a whole lecture in itself. And it's something called the non-identity problem, and here's how it comes up in the context of art. Suppose you have a technology that will enable a couple to have a baby, they're an infertile couple, but it imposes some risks on the offspring of disability or some kind of defect. Could you do it? Well, you might say, well, no, we don't want children to be born in a harmed condition. But it may be that without this technology, the child has no chance of getting born at all. And then that raises the following question: is it worse to be born with a disabling condition or never to be born at all? I'm just going to leave you with that, with that thought. I'm not going to go into it any further. We can in the discussion. Okay. The next problem is, should we even be using assisted reproductive technology to address infertility? And the first thing the critics said is, look, public health measures are a much better way to reduce infertility rather than resorting to expensive, possibly risky, high-tech solutions. And I don't think anybody would disagree with that. It would benefit more people. The problem is that the measures to prevent infertility do not address the needs of people who are infertile now, so it doesn't really address the problem. Another question is, should assisted reproductive technology be covered? If there's a national health care plan, should it be covered by it? If there isn't a national health care plan, should it be covered by insurance carriers? And different countries do this in different ways. It is expensive on the one hand. On the other hand, although the cost depends on whether the woman is using her own eggs, whether she's having to use a surrogate, you can have lots of different levels of cost depending on what's required. One of the questions this raises is infertility a disease? Those who think it is say it's a disease. Why shouldn't it be covered like any other disease? And those who think it's not think that maybe it doesn't have the same high priority. And that, of course, depends on the country's own attitude towards pronatalism. In France, for example, they're very pronatalist, and therefore you can get multiple rounds of IVF at the state's, on the state's dime. But it's usually not covered by insurance plans in the United States. Some do, but many do not. Adoption as an alternative is always a thing that comes up right away. And what people will say is, Look, adoption is a way to create a family, and it turns out that in the U.S., about 2% of children are adopted. About 1% of births are the result of IVF. So sometimes people will say things like, why would you want to go through an expensive, possibly risky procedure which has all kinds of objections to it when there are so many babies out there who need parents? In fact, that's not true, at least in the United States. The availability of healthy newborns has plummeted in the United States, partly as the result of abortion being legalized, but also, and perhaps more importantly, because being a single mother is no longer a disgrace. People keep their own children, and therefore they don't put them up for adoption. And what people who are infertile will say is, look, all we want is the child we would have had if we didn't have this medical problem. So why are you telling us that we're the ones who should take on the children who are available, who do tend, by the way, to be older, mixed race, and have disabilities? So if you are going to say that it's irresponsible to use art to create your family and more responsible to adopt babies, well, then that argument applies as much to the lucky fertile as it does to the unlucky infertile. Let fertile people adopt all those babies who are supposedly out there. Right. Adoption itself is not without problems, and I think this also has to be recognized, even while we recognize that there are many happy families created by adoption. But there are problems. Transnational adoptions raise problems because there have been cases in which some of those babies were not actually voluntarily released. There have been babies who were kidnapped, who were taken, for example. So you have to make sure you've got really good regulation. And of course, it's very expensive, just as expensive to adopt a baby from another country as to go through IVF. Transracial adoptions are also something no one should go into without thinking about it very seriously. In the United States, you're most likely to adopt a child who is African American, and now you're an African American family. And if you're not willing to accept that and realize it is your responsibility to make sure that you have African American friends and the child is introduced to African American culture, probably not such a good idea to do it. So all I'm saying is, adoption is not a panacea or a complete substitute for medically assisted reproduction. Now, the core issues, health and safety. In the beginning, when art first came, people said, we have no idea what the effects on children are going to be down the line, and therefore we should never do this. And we hear that a lot with many, many things, but this just came in because of Edwards and Steptoe. So what do we know now, today, 36 years later, 37 years later, right? There are certainly, as I said, the superovulatory drugs can be at the least uncomfortable. They can be actually very, very painful, but they also carry some risk, the most severe of which the ovaries can get twisted and it can result in death. Very small risk, very serious outcome. Some of the studies said, is there a link between having assisted reproduction and these superovulatory drugs and ovarian cancer? And what I think that most people will say now is they have found a slight correlation, but as you know, correlation is not causation. And so what some people have said is it's not the drugs that are increasing the risk of cancer, but rather women who are infertile, particularly infertile due to endometriosis, may actually have an increased risk of ovarian cancer from the underlying condition that's making them infertile, and in fact, pregnancy sometimes even reduces that risk. So we have to be very, very careful when we're talking about risks and causation. Effects on offspring, and here again, the data is contradictory. Some studies found no difference in the health outcomes, and some have found that the children that come from assisted reproduction are actually a little smarter, but that may be just because, you know, their parents are rich. I don't know. So, some studies, on the other hand, have shown an increased risk of birth defects, and again, those birth defects may be caused by the underlying problems of infertility, not the treatment for it. For example, the technique which is called ICSI, in ICSI you can take one sperm. If a man has, you know, very low sperm count and very poor motility, boys don't swim, you can take one sperm and you can jam it into the egg. And that means that a man who ordinarily would have been infertile and could not impregnate a woman may be able to become a father. But maybe the reason that he's infertile is that he has a very mild form of a genetic disease like cystic fibrosis. And then in the offspring, it may come up in a stronger form. So that may be a reason why for the infertility, not the treatment for it, although in that case, the treatment for it is enabling him to reproduce. That gets back to the non-identity problem, but anyway, we'll go on. Multiple births. So if you ask an obstetrician what is the goal, it's a healthy mother and a healthy baby. One mother, one baby. Right? That's the ideal. Multiples do cause health problems for both mother and babies. And the reasons why we get multiples with assisted reproduction is twofold. If you are using IVF and you are implanting 2 or more embryos, then you may get twins, triplets, quadruplets, right, quintuplets. America was very fascinated with a woman who gave birth to 8 babies and then was called in the media Octomom, right? The other reason why you get multiples is these super ovulatory drugs cause the woman to release more than just one egg. And that is also a way you may get twins, triplets, and so-called super multiples. And that's a lot harder to control. Prematurity is the main problem with multiples, and prematurity itself is associated with increased risk of morbidity and mortality, breathing problems. All kinds of things happen when babies are premature, and the more babies you have in there, the more likely they are to be premature. Almost, you know, a very large percentage even of twins are premature by a few weeks. And the longer you can keep babies in the womb up to the time they're supposed to come out, the better it is for the babies. Now, in recent years, the rate of super multiples, triplets and higher, has decreased. But because the techniques have gotten better, they don't have to pack 8 or 12 embryos in there in the hopes that one of them will develop. But here's an interesting sort of question. You know, the media focuses on the sexy things like Octomom, 8 babies, and those aren't actually so much of a problem anymore. In fact, that's very, very rare. It's almost unique to have that happen. There have been some of 6, but twins are still very common. And twins pose a really difficult question about procreative responsibility. Because on the one hand, the risks of long-term neurological problems, as well as stillbirth or miscarriage, are higher with twins. There's no question about it. And on the other hand, most twins are healthy. So what do you tell parents if you're the doctor, and what do you, as a responsible parent, do? The professional societies in the United States, like SART and ASRM, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, and the Society for Assisted Reproductive Technology, they recommend single embryo transfer in good prognosis patients. That is, a young woman hasn't yet had a round of IVF, do one, okay? It's different if she's in her early 40s and she's tried now 2 times, you might want to be increasing it. Interestingly enough, in Sweden, where they control what can be done medically, in the United States, there's very little state control. There's recommendations, there's guidelines from the professional societies, but there isn't much state control. In Sweden, they said you have to use single embryo transfer unless you can give a very good reason why you're putting more than one embryo in there. And the study they did after that showed that the birth rate had not fallen. So that seems like a pretty good idea. But in America, something like 12% of American fertility doctors are doing single embryo transfer in good prognosis patients. Why is that? Well, because the patients usually want 2 embryos. They think that it will give them a better chance of getting pregnant, and they have an economic motive. Instead of going through 2 rounds of IVF, right? One and done. 1 round of IVF, you have your twins, your family is now complete. And even when they understand the risks, and they may not understand the risks, they're often willing to take it. They may not understand it because, again, the media makes twins, isn't that cute? And you can dress them alike, and you get a little buggy, and they're both in there. So I'm not sure that people really are being educated sufficiently about the risk. Because one doctor, I wrote a whole long paper on this, one doctor said, when we explain to our patients the additional risk of having twins for both mother and babies, our patients are very happy to have single embryo transfer. So how much is really patients kicking back and how much is doctors wanting to keep their numbers up? Who knows? One of the objections to assisted reproductive technology is that it allows for a lot of people playing a role in reproduction. The simplest case of IVF, you have one woman, one man, they're married to one another. The rearing mother is both the genetic mother and the gestational mother, okay? All she had to do was get her eggs out of her body and artificially fertilized and then put back in her own body, and the problem is solved. The biological parents are also the rearing parents. But you can have a very complex case. You can actually have one even more complex than this, but I'll just give you this one, where you have 6 different people playing a role in reproduction. You have a sperm donor, that's the genetic, some people don't like to call him a genetic father. All I mean is the sperm comes from this guy. He's the DNA donor, right, from the male side. You have an egg donor, and she is not going to be either the gestational mother or the rearing mother. With mitochondrial DNA, that's the even more complicated one. You could even have one woman give the DNA and one woman give the mitochondria, and then you'd have 2 genetic mothers, okay? And then you have the surrogate. And then you, of course, have the rearing parents. So if you count them up, 1, 2, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 you got there. So that's an awful lot of people who are playing a role, and this can give rise to problems. For example, if you have all of these people playing a role, sometimes it ends up in court, with the court having to decide who's the real mother, who's the real father, who are the real parents. And I'll just give you one California case, Buzanka v. Buzanka, where a man and his wife were married and they wanted to have a child, and they were infertile. So they hired an egg donor and a sperm donor and a surrogate. And I think the reason they did that was they thought it would make things simpler if the egg donor was not the surrogate, for reasons I'll get to later. And then, during the pregnancy, the Buzankas divorced. And when the baby was born, Mrs. Buzanka brought the baby home and sued her husband for child support. And he said, what's this got to do with me? I'm not the kid's father. It's not a child of the marriage, not my baby, not my monkeys, And so the court said 2 interesting sorts of things. It said, first of all, to Mrs. Buzanka, you're not the baby's mother, you're going to have to adopt her. And to Mr. Buzanka, yeah, you are the father in terms of being responsible for support because it was your project with your wife to bring this child into the world, and therefore, yes, intent matters, and you are going to have to pay. Okay. So, and the court in that case said, legislatures, please figure this out. We're not equipped to doing this every time. You're going to have to figure out who the real parents are. Sometimes a sperm donor will get stuck with child support when he never intended that that was what he was going to do. Or on the other side of the coin, there was one sperm donor who gave sperm to his friends who were a lesbian couple, and then he was supposed to play a very minor role, visit the child maybe once a year, and then he got attached to the child and sought visitation or even custody, and they said, no, sperm donor. And so now what do we say about these kinds of things? They're not unique. We have it with divorced people and stuff like that, but it's even more complicated in these kinds of cases. And then with surrogate motherhood, which I'll be talking a little bit more about in a little while, there was a famous case in the United States in 1988 where the woman was not actually infertile, but she had a disease which she thought made pregnancy risky for her. So they hired a surrogate, Mary Beth Whitehead, and she was artificially inseminated with the husband's sperm. And so she was both the genetic and the gestational mother, but she wasn't supposed to be the rearing mother, but then she changed her mind. And she actually absconded with the baby, and then the question was, whose baby is it, right? Okay. The effects on the family might also, the lesson from adoption is that children often do want to know their genetic roots. They may have medical reasons for wanting to know what health risks they face, but they also may be a question of identity, and the more people you get involved in reproduction, the more difficult this becomes. And there's also a problem about, what do we call it, not incest, but if you have one sperm donor and his sperm is out a lot of places, you might have people who are actually siblings, half-siblings. And what if they get married, date and get married? So then, should you know who these people are? It's been anonymous, but really should it be? And in the United Kingdom now, there is no more. You can't have anonymous sperm donation. If you're not willing to donate and have the child know who you, by name, at age 18, they won't take your sperm. And guess what has happened to sperm donation in the United Kingdom? Right? Because people don't really want to do that. Okay. Now, commodification, and the first slide I'm going to talk about sperm and eggs, but in general, the notion of commodification is the very general idea that some things should not be for sale. And I think we would all agree with this in principle. Yes, there are some things that should not be for sale. Certainly children should not be for sale. You can't buy and sell children. Votes are something that should not be for sale. And then we get into more complicated. What about kidneys, for example? What about sex, right? And those get more controversial. So you can't just say some things should not be for sale. You have to say what things should not be for sale and why they should not be for sale. Now, in the United States, it is legal to compensate sperm and egg donors, I think in every state. I think. I could be wrong about that. And the price varies quite a lot. Sperm donors get about $50 for every donation, right? Although, interestingly enough, if you go on the web and you want Danish sperm, which is apparently the most desirable sperm, that can run you thousands of dollars. So, right, a lot of this is done on the web, by the way. How much an egg donor gets per cycle, right, the 2 weeks of getting the superovulatory drugs and then the removal of eggs, varies by region. It's about $5,000 in New York City. And there were some stories in the media about donors getting a lot more money than that. There would be ads in college newspapers which would say, looking for donor with high SATs, musical talent, athletic ability, and it would say, $50,000 or $80,000. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that some of those ads were really a bait and switch. That is, a young woman would call up and say, I have very high SATs, I play the violin, and I'm also on crew. And they would go, oh, you just missed that one. We did have a couple, and that's gone, the $80,000, but we do have a $5,000 one if you'd like to donate. A lot of unscrupulous stuff in this business goes on. The American Society for Reproductive Medicine said that $5,000 is fair compensation, because after all, it's not like sperm donation, right? You can't do it in half an hour, and it's not fun at all, okay? But they also said that paying more than $10,000 would go beyond the boundaries of what is appropriate. Again, that's not a law, that's just a suggestion from ASRM, and some clinics may abide by it and some may not. Some places don't allow you to pay sperm or egg donors, and even the term donor, people like Tom Murray have said they're not donors, they're vendors, right? They're selling. But in the United Kingdom and in Canada, they can get their expenses back, travel to the clinic and maybe even compensation for lost time at work, but no more money than that. The problem, of course, is that although you might get some altruistic donation, as it's called, for example, from sister to sister or best friend to best friend, most women are not going to go through what you have to go through to donate eggs for free, right? They're just not. Maybe some men will, and yeah, there are people who do it. Of course, the minute you do it altruistically, then you're somehow involved with the people who know who you are, and it raises its own issues. So if you restrict it and you don't allow it, first of all, you may prevent people from having children who could have done it if there was a market, a regulated market. You may also create a black market and also medical tourism, because if you cannot get eggs in Canada, come to the United States. If you cannot get eggs or sperm in the United Kingdom, go to another European country that will allow you to do it. And those raise their own questions. So let me say a little bit more about surrogate motherhood, because here's where the commodification argument has come in perhaps most strongly. And I should distinguish now between full and partial surrogacy. Full surrogacy is where the surrogate is artificially inseminated with the sperm of the, well, it could be a donor or it could be the rearing father. But it makes it full because she's both the genetic and the gestational mother. Not the rearing mother, but she's the biological mother on accounts of both gestation and DNA. Partial surrogacy, by contrast, is where the couple creates its own embryo in a petri dish and then hires somebody to gestate the embryo. The surrogate is a biological mother in the sense of being gestational, but it's not her DNA. Does that make a difference? Well, some people think it does, and some people think that it doesn't because of the question of whose baby is it, really. Then the other distinction we have to make is between altruistic and commercial surrogate motherhood. And I'll just give you a very brief rundown about, in the United States, as you probably know, most things are regulated by the states. Certainly things having to do with marriage and family and medical practice come under state law, not federal law, most of it. So in the United States, some states have actually banned any kind of surrogate motherhood, whether you get paid or not, altruistic or commercial. Some states, like my now home state of California, allow both altruistic and commercial. And some states, altruistic surrogacy is legal in the sense of not being prohibited, right? but commercial surrogacy contracts are void and unenforceable. That's New York, for example. So in a case like Baby M was actually New Jersey, but if it happened in New York, after New York changed its law, it would have said, you're out of luck, couple who wants to raise this child, because you have a void and unenforceable contract, and we're not going to uphold it. So you want to make that kind of contract? We're not going to jail you for doing it. We're not going to punish you, but we're also not going to uphold it either. There are many objections that people have given to commercial surrogacy, which has also been called by its opponents contract pregnancy. And I'll just mention a few. One is the potential for psychological harm to the children who are born as a result. And after all, what are you going to say to the child who is born? Well, your mother decided to have you in order to give us a baby and get paid for it. And it's like, really? I mean, in adoption, you do have to explain to children, well, why didn't my birth mother keep me? But there's a story you can tell an adopted child. She loved you very much, but she knew she couldn't take care of you. And therefore, she wanted you to have the best life possible. And so she gave you to us, and we're so grateful for that. But you can't really tell that story to the child born of a surrogate, since it was done for the money, right? There is another story, however, you could give the child born from a surrogate relationship, and you could say something like this: Mommy and Daddy couldn't have a baby without help, and this very nice woman was willing to help us. And if the child has any questions about the money, you can say, well, you know, we pay your babysitters, and we pay your teachers, and we pay your doctor. We pay lots of people who give us help. We paid her as well. So that's another story you might give that wouldn't be so terrible. There hasn't been a lot of research on this. The last research project that I was aware of was from 2011, and it only went for the first 3 years. This is Susan Gollum-Beck in England. She's looked at a lot of assisted reproduction. But what I can say is I know of no empirical evidence of a negative impact either on the relationship between children and parents or psychological effects on the children born to surrogates. And then I'll say, but they were only followed to age 3. So we really don't know. And then that raises another very interesting question, I think, in terms of policy and law. If we talked about procreative liberty, if you're going to restrict people's procreative liberty, it seems you ought to have good reasons for doing so. Is it enough to say maybe there might be harmful psychological effects on children? Or do you need empirical evidence that shows that it's likely that there will be such? That's another whole big issue that people can discuss. Harm to families. Some people have said what you do with assisted reproduction is you fracture parenting into these various components, gestational, genetic, and rearing, and you're just weakening the family by doing that. We've already weakened the family with routine divorce. This is just making it worse. And maybe it does. But on the other hand, thousands of babies have been born as the result of surrogate motherhood, and most of them have very happy families. So maybe it strengthens the family by enabling people who couldn't otherwise have children. And then, of course, there's concerns about the surrogates themselves. What if, as in the Baby M case, the surrogate changes her mind? What happened in the Baby M case is that when her daughter was born, and remember, she was both the genetic and the gestational mother, and when the baby was born, it looked just like the daughter she had had with her husband, and she couldn't give the baby up. Unfortunately, I mean, it's so weird because her husband was listed as the father on the birth certificate. I mean, if she had just walked out of the hospital with the baby, the Stearns, that was the couple who wanted to be the rearing parents, wouldn't have had a leg to stand on. But she didn't do that, and she gave them the baby, and then she came back a week later and said, I can't sleep, I can't eat, please just let me take the baby home for a little while. And you know, all of these people are so dumb you can hardly believe it. Anyway, they gave her the baby, and she went home with the baby, and then that's when she absconded. So what people have said is, you know, do we really want a society in which women are being forced, after they've changed their mind, to give up their children? In some states, you have a change of mind period in adoption to avoid that. Sometimes the change of mind period, however, is 24 hours, which is hardly enough to even get over childbirth. But in some places, it's as long as a month. And it also raises another question. Is it unduly paternalistic to outlaw something in order to protect people from their own decisions? Another big question in political and social theory. People also worry about the exploitation of surrogates, and generally the argument goes something like this. Look, the people who are hiring the surrogate are at least upper middle class, if not more wealthy than that. In the United States, surrogates do not tend to be impoverished. I mean, why would Americans want to hire someone who was, you know, on Skid Row? They wouldn't. But they don't tend to be upper middle class or wealthy. They tend to be sort of lower middle class, right? And what they want the money for is not to feed their children, but in the case of Baby M, for example, Mary Beth Whitehead wanted to remodel her kitchen. And in 1988, $12,000 would do it, you know, so. Is this exploitative? If you have people who are rich and people who are less rich, is that ipso facto exploitive? And then another question, if you expected the woman to be an altruistic surrogate and not get paid, is that exploitive? Or is it more fair to say, well, what's reasonable compensation, and we'll give that? After all, in assisted reproduction, the doctor gets paid, the lawyers get paid, the secretaries get paid, the receptionists get paid. Only the woman who's actually carrying the baby is the one who shouldn't get paid? Seems a little unfair. And then there's the whole question of transnational surrogacy, especially when surrogacy is made illegal. People who have money will go where it is legal, and it is still legal in India. Commercial surrogacy is a pretty thriving business. It was legal in Thailand, but has been illegal since July 30th, 2015, because of the baby Gammy case. A baby was born to the surrogate with Down syndrome. The father said, I don't want this baby. And the surrogate who had given birth to the baby said, well, I'm certainly not going to give this child up. It doesn't even have any parents now. So it was a big brouhaha, and they have now made surrogacy, commercial surrogacy, illegal in Thailand, at least for foreigners. Maybe it can be done within, but you can't come there from other countries. And in other countries, developing countries, for example, surrogates do tend to be extremely poor and are doing this in order to essentially survive. It's a way maybe to even get out of poverty. So then that raises the further kind of question. So is it exploitation, or is it providing an opportunity? We have the same debate when we talk about selling organs, and here you're not giving up something that you might eventually need, like your second kidney, but a child. Surrogates who serve in the United States often say, I loved being pregnant, and I loved the idea of helping a couple who couldn't otherwise have a baby. So how you frame the story may affect how you see whether it's exploitation or as something legitimate. And then finally, is it baby selling? Because I said earlier, we're not supposed to sell children, so if surrogacy is baby selling, that would seem to rule it out. And here's where the distinction between full and partial surrogacy may make a difference. Some people may say, well, you know, if it's her eggs and she's gestating it, then she's creating a baby and then giving it away and giving up her rearing rights for money, right? Why isn't that selling? So Angela Holder, a law professor in the United States, on being challenged with whether it should be seen as baby selling or as compensating the woman for her time, risk, and burden. She comes from the Deep South, from South Carolina, and she responded by saying, if I manufacture widgets and you put in an order for a widget and I deliver to you a widget for hard cash, I defy you to tell me that you have not purchased a widget, right? So she thinks we have to see it as baby selling. What if it's only partial surrogacy? Then the couple might say, hey, that's our embryo we had implanted in you. Our baby, you were just, looking after it like a nanny might for 9 months. So it isn't selling it, it's just getting back what's our own. I've actually written to say that properly regulated, we might be able to see prenatal surrogate motherhood not as baby selling, but as prenatal adoption. That is, the woman is being fairly compensated for her assumption of time, risk, and burden, not only gestation, but also labor and delivery. And the way I would argue for this is that if through no fault of her own she has a stillbirth, the couple may be disappointed, but they still have to pay her because she went through pregnancy, labor, and delivery. But if, on the other hand, like Mary Beth Whitehead, she changes her mind and says, now I want to keep the baby, she could do that, but she doesn't also get the money. I mean, that would be unfair. The final ethical issue that I was going to talk about today is art and eugenics, because once you have embryos outside the body, you can manipulate them. And one way you can manipulate extracorporeal embryos is by testing them for genetic disease and then getting rid of the ones that are affected. And in a previous lecture, I talked about the disability critique and people saying that discarding genetically diseased embryos shows a prejudice against people with disability, evokes the attitude, we don't want your kind around here. The other possible thing that isn't being done yet but might be done is genetic modification of human embryos, either to cure or prevent disease or for enhancement purposes, but that's the topic of the next lecture, so I'll just stop now. Thank you.
I'm sure we have many questions.
Thank you, Bonnie, for a very interesting lecture. My question is a factual one. I can quite understand why and how the woman who is doing the full surrogacy have that handover, right, after giving birth. But would it be the same in the case of a partial surrogacy? Would the woman still have the same kind of psychological handover after she deliver her product?
Yes, there have actually been a couple of cases with this. There was one woman in California, and I think she was African American, and the contracting couple was Asian, and she didn't want to give the baby up after she, just gestating and gave birth to it. So they went to court to fight about that. And in California, I think it did matter that it was that she was not the genetic parent. Other people would argue what makes you a mother is giving birth, and it doesn't matter where the egg came from. The other case, which was so interesting, was a mix-up in an infertility clinic. What happened was there was one white couple and one African-American couple, and they both had created embryos. And then through just a slip-up, the white woman had one white embryo and one black embryo implanted in her. And I think they discovered the mix-up that it had happened before she gave birth, and they contacted both couples. And after the babies were born, the white woman said, "These are my sons, and they are twins. And we're going to have to work something out. I know how you people feel, but I'm not just giving my baby away, and I'm not giving away the other ones twin brother. And so they had to go and try to work something out in court as well. My favorite part of that story was when the judge said that the pregnant woman had not behaved appropriately. And I thought, what was she supposed to do, cut herself open? I mean, what can she do at that point? They screwed up. But I do think that if a woman gives birth, it is not all that unlikely or unusual for her to feel that that's her child.
You talked, when you were talking about transnational adoption, you mentioned the case of couples adopting an African child and the need to then recognize that they were an African-American family. Now, and that also applies, I think, to this, perhaps to the mother who ended up with a black and a white child. But my question is, especially looking at the last generation where in America and other countries in the West, there have been massive adoptions of infant girls from China. The two cultures there is a big Asian American population in the U.S., but I don't think you would find that same pressure to accept yourself as an Asian American family, at least among the many, many people I know who've adopted.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I wasn't referring to adopting an African baby. I was referring to adopting an African American baby. And I was quoting the African American Social Workers Association, what they were saying, and it's probably because of the whole history of racism, et cetera, is that you cannot just pretend that your baby of African American descent is white. You have to recognize there's going to be questions of identity, and you have to be prepared to be a different kind of family if you're going to do this. Now, what about babies of Asian descent? Well, I think some people who adopt Chinese babies, I have a friend who's adopted 2 of them, do feel an obligation to make them know about their history and their culture and their ethnicity and everything, and others don't. So you get, little Jewish girls who are Chinese, right? Because they were adopted by a Jewish couple. And I leave it to the psychologists and the social workers to say which is a better attempt. If we wait long enough, we'll all look the same because we'll all intermarry and everybody will go to a shade of tan and there won't be these problems. But right now, they are real concerns, and you can't just, it seems to me, gloss over them and pretend they don't exist.
Bonnie, have you come across cases that the surrogate mother is, let's say, for the sake of example, is dark skin, and genetic father and mother, they are fair skin, and the child born turned out to be dark skin, and then genetically that child is not that child genetically is to the egg and sperm donor and not the surrogate. Have you come across cases like that?
No, but first of all, when people are, say, dark-skinned, they can have a light-skinned baby because, that's the way it works. You've got a lot of different, going back through your inheritance, and so dark-skinned couples give birth sometimes to light-skinned babies, light-skinned couples give birth to dark-skinned babies. That's, just happens naturally. And then there are mix-ups sometimes in the clinic. But right? Couple that had a baby and...
Yes, actually, that's a very pertinent. In fact, I was going to ask that question about rejection, because there has been, and I'm very well aware of a couple who have had surrogacy, a legal surrogacy arrangement, fertilized embryo, and then gestational mother, and turned out to be that the offspring was perceived to have a much darker skin, which actually resulted in the mother rejecting her. And I think that's, yeah, and I think that is an issue. So I think something like this really goes beyond the law. And I know of people who are advising on surrogacy that you actually need a lot more psychological preparation, a lot more counseling. And I think, although I mean, I'm always wary about state interference, but I think, for example, with adoption, there needs to be inquiry into, is this couple really suitable for adopting a child? And I think that is a social responsibility that someone has to consider, and that's something that the regulatory authorities should really be looking at, because at the moment there is very little to stop a couple from going, for example, to India, and there's a famous village in India where everybody wants to be a surrogate mother, and actually they make very good business. So there's nothing to stop people from going there, although on the Indian side, the regulation is very good. There are lawyers, and there are even the immigration officials help with the nationality and the passport, and you know, it's now becoming a lot more transparent. But what they cannot ascertain is what is the suitability of this couple who've come in, and what's to prevent something like this from happening. And I think it's very little that anybody can do other than the couple themselves having the responsibility to say, are we really prepared to go through this, and what if? And I think that's probably more important, the sharing of these cases of rejection and problems that these can happen, and I think people need to be aware of that.
And I think that absolutely the clinics that get involved in this should be both screening more carefully the surrogates. Actually, in the case of Mary Beth Whitehead, the psychologist said she is not a suitable surrogate mother. She's just way too invested in the child, the potential child, and the clinic ignored it for reasons. They didn't want to give it up. But if you were to say to couples who need a surrogate in order to have a child, well, we need to screen you, they would say, you mean two fertile people can go in the back of a Chevy and have a kid and nobody even asks them another question? Why are you discriminating against us? And the other thing is, sometimes I just mentioned very briefly about gay men who hire a surrogate. If you go through everything you have to do in order to have a child that way, and they spend all of this money and the disappointment sometimes when the surrogate falls through, for example, they are really dedicated to being good parents. And so the literature does show, by the way, that gays and lesbians are kind of beating out the heterosexuals on the parenthood wars.
Thanks very much for the talk. Just following on the case of rejection. So are there many of these cases that are documented, like baby Gammy? He's supposed to have been sort of not accepted by, I guess he was the genetic father, and then the gestational mother kind of took him on and didn't want to let go anyway. But are there cases building up of babies born rejected?
It's very anecdotal. I don't think that it's common. But when something like this happens, it's so terrible. There was many, many years ago, there was on one of the talk shows, it's so old I don't even remember what the talk show was, but the surrogate was told not to have sex with her husband during a certain period because she was going to be artificially inseminated with the sperm of the contracting rearing father. And apparently she did have sex with her husband. Either she didn't take it too seriously or she didn't understand the instructions about the period that she wasn't, whatever. The baby was born with microcephaly, and the man who had contracted with them said, that's not my baby, and I don't want it. And then they did genetic testing, and it wasn't his baby, it was her husband's baby. And so they said, well, we're going to raise it and love the child and all this this and that. But I think the cases are extremely rare. It's just they are so distressing when they happen. And I guess what I would say about something like this is it does seem to me for a clinic to say, I don't know if it should be a law, but for a clinic to say, you know, you make this commitment to the child. This is just like having your own child. You don't get to say afterwards, well, that wasn't exactly what we wanted. You want to do this, you're going to be responsible for this child. Write that down.
One more.
It seems to be problematic for selling the children, but if we do hold this view, we need a mathematical view. But if we hold a view that interests of every people should be protected, then I don't see full surrogacy is a problem, because it is the woman's right to give up their rearing rights for money. That's my comment.
You're our libertarian, aren't you? Well, again, you might think that she has the right to give up her rearing rights for money, or you might want to argue that that's not the kind of thing that should be imposed. You know, there have been other things that I didn't get into. For example, can the contracting couple make all kinds of demands on the surrogate mother, including that she will have prenatal testing and will abort if the child has, for example, Down syndrome? And some American lawyers, George Annis is one of them, says that's unconstitutional. You cannot make someone give away their right to make their own decision about whether they will or will not abort. So I think there's lots of room for saying what we as a society think would be a reasonable thing to do or not be a reasonable thing to do. And I think actually paying the woman is one of the less controversial ones. It seems to me she should be fairly compensated. These are much more difficult kinds of questions about how it should be regulated in the practice of it.
Okay, we'll have to stop here so that Bonnie has a break and refreshes herself before the enhancement talk. But I actually have a pleasant duty to request the founder of the CUHK Center for Bioethics and our chief patron, Dr. Edgar Cheng, to actually thank both Bonnie and Paul Menzel for the wonderful introductory lectures and actually a lot more that they have done during their stay. So, yes, Bonnie. Professor Paul Menzel. Paul. And then we are going to stand and have a photograph with them too. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, next topic.